Your remarks.
Yeah,
Great. You wanna?
Yeah.
So people can actually see.
Mm-hmm.
So you've all seen Dr. Strangelove, right? Right before the scene, the famous title sequence. There's this little thing.
For more than a year, ominous rumors have been privately circulating among high-level Western leaders that the Soviet Union had been at work on what was darkly hinted to be the ultimate weapon, a doomsday device. Intelligence sources traced the site of the top-secret Russian project to the perpetually fog-shrouded wasteland below the Arctic peaks of the Zhukov Islands. What they were building, or why it should be located in such a remote and desolate place, no one could say.
So the Zhukov Islands do exist, but they are way off here. But what we're focusing on today is an archipelago called Novaya Zemlya, which was where the Soviet Union actually had a nuclear testing base. And so they had 3 different testing zones on Novaya Zemlya, A, B, and C. And A was used for underwater nuclear tests as well as a few atmospheric tests. Zone C, you will recognize from some of Soviet Union's greatest hits, like Tsar Bomba, where they did atmospheric tests. And then Zone B, which we focused on, was where the Soviet Union built an underground nuclear test site.
But this was well above the Arctic Circle, is very remote. It's why Tsar Bomba was done up there. Although that was an atmospheric test, and we're mostly going to be focused, as Anne said, on Site B, where underground nuclear tests occurred. So this is the site. This is Zone B. There you can see up here. There's a little settlement. It's a place called Severny, and there's a river valley. And so there's a big mountain here, a big mountain here, and then down here there's another mountain. And this is where the Soviet Union did, what, 31?
31 tests between 1964 and 1990.
So just to give you a sense of underground nuclear testing at Novaya Zemlya, that's a nuclear test in a shaft. There were tests like that at other places in the archipelago, but most places were horizontal tunnels dug into mountains like this. Although there are a few cases where they dug in and then they dug a shaft. So that's the kind of testing that we're seeing at this site, and that's what we wanted to explore. So this is a good example of one of those test tunnels. This is a hill. This is a metal, basically just a building that is a tunnel entrance. It's called an adit, and you can see out of the mouth of the adit, you can see all this spoil, right, which is dirt that's been removed from the tunnel to allow for testing, and then there are typically some small support buildings around it.
So this is kind of the layout.
We can both do the talk.
I know. So this is the layout kind of the entire test valley. It is on the Shumalika River Valley, and it is right off of Matochkin Shar, which is a strait that bisects the 2 largest islands of the archipelago. And so you can kind of tell, this is a map of seismic data locating the relative locations of tests that were conducted at this site. And so there's a big mountain right here where a large number of tests were carried out, and then as time went on, the Soviets moved down the river valley into a mountain down here, and we'll talk about later.
They stopped using that mountain.
Yes. This was only used for 3 tests. We will show you why. Before they moved over to the other side of the river valley, where the balance of their tests were carried out. And so the last one was in 1990, and it was, I believe, this one right down here.
And the reason that we're kind of walking you through this is we want to show you how you can monitor nuclear testing sites today. You know, in the past, the way you would monitor a site like this was purely through seismic data. And so, you know, there are maps of this place, and there are estimates of where explosions happened. But it turns out those estimates are not really all that accurate. Like, they're pretty good, but they don't tell you exactly where the explosions took place. So the next one's that satellite photograph, right?
Mm-mm.
No?
It's our other maps.
Oh, right.
So one of the issues that we ran into with our seismic data was that we had multiple sources, multiple maps. None of the maps matched. So the next two slides are two maps from equally authoritative Russian anthologies on their underground testing history, both edited by the same individual.
And you want to, so the red circles are the locations of the explosions, and they're numbered in blue. And so, for example, keep your eye on these 5 red circles from this map, which is definitely authoritative, to this map, which is definitely authoritative. They're all gone and they've moved over here. These two maps, if you toggle between them, are not consistent. Both of them are published under Mikhailov, the head of the Soviet nuclear program at the end. They just don't agree. I mean, it's nice we have a list of all the events, like the dates for sure, the number of the tunnel, and how big the total of all the nuclear explosives that were detonated, but there's just no agreement. And you wanted to say?
Yeah, but what we don't have in this list are exact coordinates for test locations. There's no magical list that we were able to find that had test date, tunnel name, exact location of where that tunnel is. We have the seismic data of where the explosions are, but one of the things that we needed to rectify was what we could see in the seismic data on the maps with what we would eventually come to see in the satellite imagery. Right,
because we really want to know where each of these tests took place, because we want to understand the evolution of this test site over time, because we're interested in if Russia were to resume nuclear testing, where would that happen, and are any of these tunnels unused tunnels? And so we really wanted to correlate every event to every tunnel we could find, but you can't really do that with the seismic data, and you can't really do that with the maps. And so traditionally the thing you would do is you would try to use satellite images to rectify that. But there's a problem. That is a recent satellite image of Novaya Zemlya. It is in fact perpetually fog shrouded. It is not, there are clear days, but monitoring this test site, the reason you never see satellite photographs of it in publications is because they're very hard to get. If you were to go into Google Earth has a single image and it's really not very good. And so, I should say something nice about Geo for Non-Pro, right? So we wanted to look at this a couple years ago for Geo for Non-Pro, and we, as you can see, the images we were able to get at the time, there was like a 2007 and an 8 and an 11. That's not very intensive coverage. And this mosaic is one we had to commission at great expense. So we had to pay an Israeli company to fly a satellite over Novaya Zemlya to take a picture just for us. We had to give them the money, and they said, now it's very cloudy, right? So you give them the money, you don't actually get a guarantee that you will ever get a cloud-free picture. Melissa Hannum and Catherine Dill and I waited all summer long as it made pass after pass after pass. It was cloudy every day, and only in the last week did we get a pair of clear images. It's a mosaic because it wasn't cloudy the whole day, you can see, but we had enough that we could put together. So with Geo for Non-Pro, everybody went through and pinned all of the tunnel entrances and all of the features, which was a pretty good, I think, first start, but Ann and I wanted to do a much deeper dive into the test site.
But we should note that we were not the first people to attempt this. There were some researchers that came before us, most notably a Norwegian man by the name of Johnny Skorby, who was instrumental in helping us launch kind of this deep dive into some of these specific locations at the test site. And the story is just it's going to remain one of the best stories probably forever of my career. So Johnny, he was one of the first people to undertake a satellite study of the test site. He and a couple other colleagues did.
When was that?
They're initially in 1992.
Yeah, so he did 2 studies, one in 1992 and then a second one in 2006. And I was able to acquire a digital copy of the 2006 study, but I really, really, really wanted to find the 1992 study that was kind of the basis for all of his research. And so I started cold emailing people his former colleagues trying to find contact information for him because he was a ghost in the digital world. They couldn't find him. And so finally, one individual responded and was very regretful, and he told me, he was like, I'm really sorry to tell you that Johnny passed away a few months ago. But your interest in his work, I'm sure, would have brought a smile to his face. I was like, oh man, like I really wanted to talk to this guy. I really wanted to get this report. About a week later, I received a series of very strange emails from someone claiming to be Johnny Scorby, my scientist that I was trying to contact, who has apparently passed away. So I emailed the first individual back and said, I don't know if someone is, that this is a case of a mistaken identity or what happens, but I just want to let you know that someone is emailing me pretending to be this individual. I just thought you should know in case there's something weird going on. Turns out that he did not pass away. The individual was I feel bad finding this.
He was mortified.
But he was mortified that he had told me that the individual had passed away, and so he was actually like, I'm happy to report that he's actually alive. He had a rough spell and he's okay, but his family says that your interest in his work is, galvanized him, and he's like, has a new lease on life.
So he started sending us copies of his older reports that we couldn't get.
So I started emailing with him, and he actually, he sent me by post mail the original report. And so we were flipping through it, and there are some gems.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
There are some gems.
He really did some incredible work. One of the questions is like, how do you get pictures of Novaya Zemlya before nuclear testing started in 1964? Well, it wouldn't be 2018 unless there were Nazis involved. Johnny actually went into the U.S. archives. He was an incredible. He's still with us. But when he was doing this work, he was an incredible researcher, and it's really a treat. So after World War II, the United States has all the Luftwaffe aerial reconnaissance photographs. Well, some poor pilot had to fly over Novaya Zemlya, photographing it.
Before this was ever a test site. So
yeah.
there's no settlement here. There are no roads. There's pristine.
Right, so it ends up being really useful because, so Johnny Scorby did not have the high resolution satellite photographs we're going to show you, so how do you know a nuclear test? Well, if you have a clear version, right, there's no settlement, and then he's marked various places, as well as he didn't mark them up here, but you can see there's no disturbance, right? And then he got this is a spot photograph. I don't know if people remember spot. At the time it was great, right? But if you saw it now, it's not all that great, right? You can kind of see that there's a settlement here, right? It's not that great. But what you can see are craters from the nuclear test. So you can actually figure out precisely where they happened. And then there are these two little rock piles. One of them
here's that.
This is a
92.
This is a modern picture.
Mm-hmm.
So yes.
Was he the first one to actually do a study on this, or was there a previous report?
No, he's the first one to do the study on this. He really, obviously the U.S. government probably was doing it, but we had never seen anything like this on open source.
So he had identified these two kind of blips into the strait, and so one, it turns out, is a spoil pile from the excavation of a tunnel, and then this one is the rock slide of the subsequent test that was carried out in said tunnel. And so even with the lower resolution imagery, he was able to do some really amazing work. He was the first one to identify some catastrophic events that had occurred at the test site. And one of those was a massive test that was in September of 1973. And do
you remember the mountain we told you they stopped using?
It collapsed the mountain, basically. So this is the mountain before any activity occurred. And then these roads right here in the snow, and then this kind of blob right here is actually the footprint of the test base that was set up prior to the test that was carried out. And then this image is from after the test, and this right here is rock slide, and this entire base of the mountain gave way, caved in, it buried the test base.
To give you a sense of scale, this is the size of downtown DC.
Between the Capitol and the White House.
This is a lake that did not exist previously. This was a creek that flowed in. It became dammed up and became a giant lake.
So.
And my favorite part of this is they found this and they went to the Norwegian government and they were like, in 1973, there was a catastrophic event at the Russian nuclear test site at Novaya Zemlya. There was a massive rock slide that collapsed the mountain and buried the whole testing base underground. You know, a significant number of people probably died. And the Norwegian government was like, nah, we would have heard about that. And he's like, but the picture, right? And it's not until the Soviet Union collapsed, and well, it had, when he published the study, it collapsed, but it took a few years for openness to happen, and then the Soviets said, yes, that is precisely what happened, and they released pictures of the rock slide. So you can do a lot with low resolution imagery.
And these, I should note,
yes.
These images, he actually went back and again went to the National Archives and purchased old declassified Corona and KH-7 spy satellite images. And that's how he was able to do this, and he was able to determine which, again, we don't have coordinates for this location, X test was carried out at these exact coordinates on this day, but he was able to do one tunnel, or he was able to piece together a bunch of different satellite images to show when they constructed the base, when they might have carried out the test, and then to see the rock slide.
So we wanted to do exactly the same thing, but we wanted to do it for all of the test tunnels, right? We wanted to try to match every event to every test tunnel that we could find. And we didn't do them all, but
we're working
pretty
on
close.
We're working on it.
And I think now we have a pretty decent understanding of how the test site went, and so we're going to tell you a little bit about how we went ahead and did that.
So we decided to take a cue from Johnny and go and purchase some old satellite imagery, which was probably my favorite part of this entire project, because these images, these old analog images, were just so incredibly stunning. And the detail that we could see was quite remarkable. And when I first opened an image from 1970, I'm pretty sure it brought tears to my eyes, because it was a piece of the puzzle that finally fell into place, and it's just the greatest moment ever. So there were a number of those, but
Anne's fun at parties.
honestly,
So this is the same high resolution image. This is a better version of it, of the one we just showed you from Johnny Scorby's test, right? So this is the mountain before it's collapsed, and this is the test base that is about to be covered in rubble.
When you say high resolution, what do you mean?
A couple feet, 2 to 3 feet.
How large was the test?
Oh, this was the largest, and it was
3.3 megatons.
that was actually the one where they dug into the mountain, and then the mountain was not big enough, and then they dug down.
There were 4 charges, and it was the Soviet Union's largest ever underground nuclear test.
And maybe they did one more, and then they eventually gave up on this mountain.
Yeah, well, they built this test base, and usually they would dig a couple tunnels and use this kind of as the setup area. But after this test, they flew around to the other side, do 2 tests over here, and then they're like, all right, we're just gonna move to the other side of the valley. But one of the, we have, through our partnership with Planet, we have plenty of current satellite imagery, so we can see how the test site looks today. And what we really wanted to know was kind of the history of the expansion of the test site. So which zones were used first, and how many tests, and trying to match up tests to their various areas. And so what we could do by purchasing all of these old satellite imagery, satellite images, was to start to match up tests to tunnels by using kind of the period in which they would dig the tunnel and then very shortly after tests there. And so this is an image from 1967. It's from March 1967. And so this is the settlement. And so the orientation is, instead of looking
North is
down the
this way.
valley, we're looking up. And so here's the settlement, and then this is where the ship broke through the ice to get to the dock over here. But the most interesting part is that this is the construction of what would become tunnels A4 and A5. And these tunnels were used 6 months after this image was taken for a test on like October 10th of 1967.
So this ends up being really useful for us
So this
because
is Corona.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what we're beginning to do is we're beginning to determine which tunnels go with which events, but we're also learning what the test signatures look like, right? So we can see the same. I mean, you know, when the U.S. said, well, there might be a test at Novaya Zemlya, like this was the picture, right? And so you know, we're both understanding the construction patterns at the test site, but we're also understanding the signatures on an individual basis.
And you know the yield, right? of each of them.
Yes, because we have, you know, happily, you know, this is a case where we can tell exactly which one it is, and we can correlate the tunnel name, the date, and the yield. It's not always that clean, actually, I think, which is the next case study, or the next example shows.
The yield says it was about 260 kilotons.
But there were multiple devices that added up to
And
that.
what's the distance between the camp and the tunnel, that tunnel right there?
That's
It's a few miles. Like this is this black splotch is a building,
Right.
right? So it's not far.
4 or 5 miles?
Yes. I mean, I would have to measure it, but you know, like that's literally that's not like a giant building. That's like a
shack.
yeah. So you know, I don't know. That looks like, I don't know, like a 10-minute drive if the roads aren't covered in terrible Novaya Zemlya ice. I love, by the way, they've broken the ice and it started to freeze back over.
Yeah.
This is another image, again, the same settlement, and then this is the front side of the first testing zone. And so this is a 1970 Corona image, and over here is another test base, which, again, the maps that we have showed a handful of tests in this zone throughout the history of the site. But you know, the road is still clear, it's still active. We can see that it was indeed, it correlates with several of the tests on our map that were carried out.
Well, I love this example because this is clearly event 8. Because event 8 is marked here on the map. The problem is event 8 is also marked at a different place on the map. Just vaguely aggravating, although I'm pretty sure this is where event 8 happened because of the preparation.
But it's not even 8 is in a different spot on
that's
each
right.
other map. There are 2 8s.
2 8s.
On one map. And there's only one event.
Because, you know, why bother to get the historical data right in your own records, right?
Yeah. So
The site is now abandoned.
No.
No.
So the whole purpose of doing this is to literally, sorry, we're belaboring it because we enjoyed the act of literally understanding its evolution. This site is still active, and we will end with what they are doing today. But it's not. This isn't purely indulgent. You needed to see the test signatures to understand that what you're about to see is unusual.
One of the most interesting things that we found out about the site is that there were a number of tests that vented large amounts of radioactive gas into the atmosphere. About actually 14 of the 31 tests released a significant amount of radiation, which was described as above 1,000 curies. So this diagram right here is from tunnel A37, and we found it in a historical document explaining Soviet practices for containing nuclear tests. And so they were like, okay, this is a diagram of what one of their test setups looks like. And so each of these little spots is where they would place one of the charges.
And then the tunnel entrance is empty.
Yeah. So we knew that this was labeled as tunnel A37, which was one of the tests that vented. It was on October 11th, 1982. So we thought, well, we don't have coordinates for where A37 was, but this map may actually help us because we have some elevation data.
Before we do that though, I have to say, I love this. They used this tunnel in October 82 and it vented a little. And so then they decided to reuse it in 1987 with a new entrance, and then it vented a lot. Guys, knock it off with A37, okay? It's a graphic tunnel. Oh, by the way, I should also say, remember, so we're looking for entrances which we can see. On the map, there are little circles for the explosion. There were actually 4 and they were pretty spread out. So that's a good sign that your map is not, the map is not like the best source. But yeah, this elevation data was great. Sorry.
No, it's fine, but we wanted to use this map to help figure out exactly which tunnel A37 was.
Which turns out it's really easy.
So we did that. We overlaid the image into Google Earth and we started trying to fit it with all of the different tunnel entrances that we could see. So matching up the bearing of the tunnel entrance as it was going into the mountain, as well as best we could the topographic lines. And lo and behold, we were able to do that, and it was an exciting moment. But it gets better. Because this location, there were 2 adits or tunnel entrances, and so we matched up this image to one of the tunnel entrance bearings, but it left into question, like, is this actually the site A37? Because we know that there's A37 and then there's A37A. So are we going to get lucky? And are these 2 tunnel entrances that we see, are those indeed A37 and A37A? And the short answer is that yes, actually, they are. But we were able to figure that out because of Johnny Scory. This is a very horrible image that he included in one of his reports, and it was a picture after one of the events that vented.
This is it, rifling out of the entrance. And the helicopter is standing there for precisely this, so that people can run to the helicopter and get the hell away.
And he had, in his caption, written that this was at tunnel A37A. And the test was carried out in like August of 1987.
And in fairness to the Russians, I mean, we're making fun of this particular test for venting. I mean, the U.S. had tested vented. There's one called Bainbury in 1970 that was, you know, just every bit as bad. So like this is a thing. This is why we don't do nuclear testing anymore, right? Like this happens.
So using this image, I was like, okay, well, I think I have a general idea of where this test is. So I'm gonna go see if they match up. So this helicopter is the kind of the focal length is kind of distorting how far away the helicopter is to the actual tunnel and the venting. But after this test, it caused a massive evacuation mission where there were like 14 helicopters to carry away all of the test personnel.
Just the concrete pads because it's frozen.
No, I got it.
Oh, I'm just so excited.
So,
of course you got it.
But so Jeffrey found actually in Google Earth that there is a spot that was yay far away from this front area of the testing zone that was kind of in the line of sight of tunnels A37 and A37A, and there were concrete pads there, and so we were like, huh, maybe those are helicopter pads. So turns out we go to Google Earth and...
Oh, before you go, we have to point out, notice the hillside, there's this kind of snow in this like crown that's filled in, and there's this kind of spot that's filled with snow, and over here this is kind of lump, right? Just, you know.
Do you want to point them out?
No, I
know. But...
Okay, well here's the crown, and that's that weird lump.
So even after, what, 30 some odd years after the test, the topographer, geography is basically the same. There's some differences, but we were,
It's snowier some years, not as much others.
But this was the vantage point, and so where I would be standing in this image is on top of one of the concrete pads. There were like 3 of them in a line, and so you see there's this kind of hump that's right here. It's actually a hill that was raised where the concrete pads were, and so we were like, oh, okay, so yes, this is A37 and A37A, and we used 2 radically different sources of information to kind of come to that same conclusion, which was really rewarding in this type of work. Of we started this, and then in a completely different document, about a few weeks later, I noticed this photo, and the date matched up with the tests that occurred in A37A, and I was like, oh my gosh, it's from the same place. And so it was just one thing after another, puzzle pieces started falling into place for a number of these locations.
Okay, so the point of this is, we now really understand the evolution of this test site, right? We know what test preparations look like, we know what test tunnels look like, we know where the Russians tested at the site, we understand how that moved. All that ends up mattering in the present day because the United States continues to believe that even though Russia has signed and ratified the CTBT, that there must be some kind of secret prohibited activities going on, right? And sometimes that expresses itself in embarrassing ways. In 1997, there was an earthquake off the coast of Novaya Zemlya, which was very close to the test site. Now, that's not exactly the same place, but remember we told you the seismic data is not always exactly reliable as to location. So some people might have said, wow, that's an earthquake very close to Novaya Zemlya. The United States intelligence community said, oh my God, you conducted a secret nuclear test and demarched the Russians. This was embarrassing. One of the things that comes out afterwards as the intelligence community is trying to defend itself for demarching the Russians for conducting an earthquake is they get very defensive and they say, but there were signatures, right? Now you and I, we've now started to look at those signatures a little bit. Well, here's a signature. Technicians there have been flying around in helicopters, lowering equipment, plugging test holes, and stringing cables for diagnostic equipment. Like, helicopters are a thing. When this came out in the 1990s, civil society couldn't say anything. The intelligence community says, well, helicopters, that's a sign, and everybody has to kind of nod along like that's a reasonable thing to say. I don't know, Anne, you seen some helicopters at Novaya Zemlya?
Yeah, because it's such a large area and there are no roads, and so to get from one settlement to another, helicopters.
There are helicopters
way to get around
all the time, right? And in 1997, nobody knew that because only people who had access to classified satellite photographs had some opinion about how common helicopters were. But now civil society can say, if that is your signature, you need to get a different job because there are helicopters there all the time.
This is from Russian social media. Helicopter on the airfield. It's the way to get around. It doesn't mean anything, and also this site was never abandoned. I don't know, someone wasn't doing their job.
Right, so what we think happened was that the earthquake happened at a time that the Russians were probably conducting a subcritical nuclear test, which would not be prohibited by the CTBT, right? And so while most of the work that we did was historical in nature, it now allows us to look at ongoing activity at the test site today and have some opinions about what we're seeing.
Yes. You started out by showing how, according to 2 authoritative sources, there were the discrepancy in location. Are you coming back to why that? Do we know why the story?
We think that they just took seismic data and used that to represent the events. So the historical source, instead of sitting down with the map and saying, okay, well, we know the precise location of each tunnel, and drawing in the depth that they dug, and then putting it in, we think that they just took seismic data and dumped it on top of the map and said, well, that's close enough,
And then they did it a second time?
with different seismic data.
About 6 years apart. One was published in 2000 and another in 2006.
Yeah, but so one of those beautiful examples where you think a historical document is going to represent deep knowledge of the site, but in fact, they kind of probably didn't know exactly, like at the time you know where the thing you're digging is because you drive out to it, but they may not have taken very good records of where it was, and so we're actually recreating information that they may not have any longer. But we want to bring this to the present day, and then I promise we'll end. I mean, this is the big.
Why do you think they're doing subcritical tests there?
For the same reason that we do them underground in Nevada, which is what we're about to say.
The infrastructure was already here, and there are interviews that Sig Hecker conducted and actually are in the appendices of Doomed to Cooperate, where he asks testing officials, like, are you going to build, a subcritical test facility or whatever, and they were like, well, no, we already have the site, so we don't have the money to build
So let's go, right?
a separate site apart
we got,
from Novaya Zemlya.
Like, we're here, right? Well, so this is a tunnel, right? Looks like a tunnel, looks like every other tunnel you've seen. It's precisely activity at a tunnel like this that causes the US, I think, to mistake a subcritical test for a nuclear test, because from the outside, it's just people going in and out of tunnels, right? Something really interesting happened in 2013 at this particular tunnel, which is a new tunnel was dug, and this ground was cleared. Now, already this should be interesting to you because that does not look like a normal test thing, right? This is abnormal. So we watched this. And then they built buildings, which is very abnormal. None of those test sites have dedicated infrastructure. And what we think this is, right, the next one is this is the Russian version of this. This is U1A. It is a unused U.S. nuclear test shaft at the Nevada test site, which is where the U.S. does its subcritical tests. In fact, here's one of those tests. The explosive is inside this chamber. There are X-ray cameras and other things trained on the object. That's an alarm. Everyone needs to get back. Command, right? The U.S. does this. We think that the Russians are doing this too. And so, to sort of end, you have this case of the Kara Sea incident where a subcritical test plus an earthquake leads to a real diplomatic incident and a false accusation of cheating. Right? And that's a bad thing, but it happens in part because there aren't really good understandings of the signatures and what's actually happening at Novaya Zemlya. We think that if this is an underground subcritical test site, then, which we think because the signature doesn't match an actual previous nuclear test, right? The reason they have these buildings is because they're going to use this thing over and over and over again, and they don't want to have to, constantly drive in and out.
Another critical piece was that before we saw this image, the Russians announced that they were going to resume subcritical nuclear testing at Novaya Zemlya.
Right. So that corresponded with the construction.
And then, yes, immediately after was when we saw the second tunnel and then the buildings.
So what exactly announced?
They announced that they were going to resume subcritical nuclear testing at Novaya Zemlya.
So I'm just trying to bring it home just to end the whole thing.
Yeah.
And Sarah Bidgood has written about this too. Like, there are accusations that Russia is violating the CTBT, conducting very low yield experiments. I don't believe that that's true, but that is a major argument against ratifying the CTBT in the United States. When you have to abstractly imagine how you are going to verify that, that is really hard. When you actually have a place, right? Like, well, I know how to verify what goes on here. Like, there's one way in and one way out. There are 4 buildings. People like Frank von Hippel have talked about the kinds of confidence building and transparency measures you could put into place to verify that subcritical testing was not crossing the line into prohibited activities. And I think it is much easier to imagine doing that when you can see the place where those activities are happening.
Where's the line?
Where's what line?
It's like not crossing the line.
Oh, sorry, the CTBT prohibits explosions. So
Right.
it is a
So-
zero yield. So if the,
So how much is allowed to do in subcritical?
so you cannot produce nuclear yield. So for example, you could implode natural uranium. You could implode small amounts of plutonium so that it did not cause a chain reaction. But if there is any,
Yield whatsoever?
that's right. Now, one of the interesting things about the CTBT is it is a treaty that exists among nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states. And so the nuclear weapon states reached a side agreement in more technical detail about what activities would be permitted and what activities would not be permitted. The treaty itself does not define an explosion. It's very vague. It just says no explosions. And then there is a side agreement, which the United States claims to not have a copy of anymore, but which
And that's
might...
classified or it's not?
No, it's skullduggery. The Chinese and the Russians still claim they have their copies. But Steve Ledigar, when he was the ambassador negotiating it, because I actually interviewed him for my dissertation, he sat down with the other members of the P5 in the Chinese embassy, and they negotiated a more technically explicit list of prohibited and permitted activities.
And what year was that?
That was in 1996 when the treaty was. It was in parallel to the negotiation of the CTBT, but they just did it on the side because nobody wanted to. I don't want to pick on some random country, but pick some non-nuclear weapon state. No one wanted to sit that country down and say like, okay, well here's how you do hydronuclear testing, right? That would be more complicated. So they
Never heard it before.
Yeah, well, it has led to accusations that the treaty it contains no definitions, which is true but kind of misses the point, right? It contains no definitions because non-nuclear states wouldn't be able to do subcritical testing in a way that would be useful for them, and so it made much more sense to leave the treaty vague and to have the P5 separately agree to a list of measures. Which again, gets us back to this thing, which is when people say, well, we can't ratify the CTBT because we don't really know what the Russians are doing. It's like, well, you can ask, like you can go, right? If there were political will, we could invite them to U1A and we could go here.